Welcome back to another episode of Stimulate Your Mind. I'm your host, Ali A, with my co-host, Ali A as well.
Thank you.
And with us today is PhD Student in Political Economy, Jay Tharappel. How are you, Jay?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. And you can find his work on the website, theorientaldespot.com.
That's right.
Is that correct? Now, the Yemen conflict.
Yes.
Since March 2015, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have led a coalition of states in Yemen against Houthi forces that took over Yemen's capital, Sana'a, in September 2014. Now, the armed conflict in Yemen has resulted in the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, which was actually stated by UNICEF themselves.
That's right.
And parties to the conflict have killed and injured thousands of Yemeni civilians. According to the Yemen Data Project, more than 17,500 civilians were killed and injured since 2015. And a quarter of all civilians killed in air raids were women and children. More than 20 million people in Yemen are experiencing food insecurity, and 10 million of them are at risk of famine. So this coalition that has been led against Yemen, we know that's, according to the internet at the very least, is by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Are there any other countries that parties to this conflict?
Last time I counted, 22 countries.
22 countries.
Because you've got the Anglo-American powers, so Britain, United States, Australia. These countries are selling weapons, right? And they're also involved in imposing the naval blockade to choke off Yemen from outside trade, which prevents Yemen from importing food. I mean, prior to the conflict, Yemen imported something like 90% of its food. And so when you impose that blockade, that's what's causing the mass starvation. That's what's causing anywhere between 50 to 60% of the population to be currently starving, right? So by the end of the conflict, the death toll could be in the millions as a consequence. But yeah, as for the number of countries, 22 to 26 from what I remember, right?
22.
And that's like, you've got countries like, Bosnia, Malaysia, Sudan, the Gulf states, all of them except for Oman, honorable exception, and also except for Qatar because they pulled out in 2017. But it's been a huge business because Saudi Arabia's got the money and they're willing to pay for the most high-tech, sophisticated gadgets and weapons of death in order to protect the lives of the mercenaries that they've sent to Yemen.
So you're mentioning 22 to 26 countries, yet when you go online, social media, on the internet, or wherever you look, there hasn't been any international outrage as to what's happening. Yes, the UNICEF has named it as the largest humanitarian crisis to ever happen. But apart from that, it's just words on a paper.
Yeah. I think there's a reason for that. One of the reasons is because a large chunk of the Muslim world relies on remittances from the Gulf states. So even the part of India that I'm from, Kerala, right? It relies on remittances from countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE especially. And so if you have this dependence on these Gulf countries, then you're less likely to speak out against the crimes that they commit, right? So if you look at the invasion of Iraq, right? A lot of countries were against it, right? Turkey was against it. And because Turkey has this position of influence, right, within the Muslim world, particularly the Sunni Muslim world, a lot of people found it very easy to take up opposition to the invasion of Iraq. But when it comes to the war against Yemen, that's the issue that we find, right? There's a financial disincentive for speaking out against the conflict. Not only that, if you look at the UN resolution, UN Resolution 2216 that was passed in 2015. This is what essentially green-lighted the war against Yemen. Now, this UN resolution recognizes the Saudi coalition as acting on behalf of what they call the legitimate government of Yemen. And so this is a problem, right? Because the so-called legitimate government of Yemen is overwhelmingly dominated by foreigners, right? 84% of the Saudi-led coalition's forces are not Yemeni. Right? They're foreign mercenaries. You've got 100,000 to 150,000 Saudi mercenaries, and they themselves are not Saudi. They're drawing on mercenaries from all over the world. So you look at the Muslim world in particular, there's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of people who really have no hope, right? And so what did the Saudis do? They go to these countries, they recruit them to become mercenaries. And so there's also a financial incentive there, right? Like, unfortunately, these people are being paid, right? And so that's their only motivation. And so they need to be protected when they go out into the battlefield to fight against the Yemeni national resistance. And that's when the high-tech gadgetry of the Anglo-American countries come in to provide them with the armored personnel carriers and vehicles and, you know, special, I don't know all of the military tech, right? But all of that in order to make it as lucrative as possible to attract mercenaries. So 84% of the Saudi side is made up of foreigners, whereas the local indigenous Yemeni national resistance, right, is 100% indigenous. But what does the media say? The media says that this 100% indigenous national resistance movement, they're Iranian-backed proxies, right? And that's the injustice of this situation. A lot of people think that it's an international conflict involving multiple countries. So if you say, well, what about the Saudis, right? Like, look at what they're doing. They're committing a genocide in Yemen. A lot of people say, oh, well, what about Iran? I say, what about Iran? What are they doing exactly? Like, recently, 2 days ago, the Yemeni health ministry, they were thanking two countries in particular for helping them out with medical assistance, Iran and Oman, right? So at least Iran is trying to alleviate the situation by sending over medical assistance. What's Saudi Arabia doing? They're starving the country. Like, so this idea that you can put an equal sign between Iran and Saudi Arabia makes no sense. One side is completely indigenous. That's the Yemeni national resistance, the Houthis, as you refer to them. Ansarullah is their real name.
Yep.
And then on the other side, you've got the Saudi-backed mercenaries, and they are 84% foreign.
So what are the similarities and differences between the Syrian revolution and the Yemeni revolution led by the Ansarullah?
It's a very good question. Well, usually the way this particular question gets framed is in a far more hostile manner. People say, you know, you support the Yemeni revolution, the Houthi revolution, but you don't support the Syrian revolution, right? Why is that? It's a very good question. The difference is that in the case of Yemen, Ansarullah actually never tried to take up arms against the Yemeni state. The Yemeni state took up arms against them. So this begins, if you go back to 1994, this is when Ansarullah was founded. Its original incarnation was an organization called the Believing Youth, right? Shabab al-Mu'mineen.
Yep.
And this was founded by Hussein al-Houthi. That's the original founder of the Houthis. Now, all they wanted to do was enter politics, right? They were not taking up arms against the Yemeni government. And they were trying to revive Zaidi ideology, right? And then come 2004, the United States has invaded and occupied Iraq. There's pressure on the Yemeni government to crack down on Ansarullah. Ansarullah are acting within the boundaries of the constitution. This has to be made abundantly clear. It has to be repeated over and over again. They are not rebels in the sense that they just decided one day, let's take up arms against the Yemeni state. It's because the United States considered them to be a threat, and because Saudi Arabia perceived them to be a threat also, that they decided to go to the mountains in Sada and murder the leader of the Houthis, that is Hussein al-Houthi, in 2004. They went there, they chased his family into a cave, then they doused the cave, they filled the cave with petrol and set it on fire. It was a massacre. Him and 20 of his family members were murdered, right? Now you compare that to the Syrian conflict, right? In Syria, the war is driven by the attempt to overthrow the Syrian state, right? So it's actually driven by this attempt to take up arms against the government, right? Then you have to ask the question, have these attempts been popular with the Syrian people? I would argue no, right? I mean, even the FSA fighters back in 2012 rather, when they were being interviewed by Time magazine, they would say, look, 70% of the people support the government. They were honest enough to admit that, right? And the other thing is that a country like Syria, there's no way that the government would still be there if they didn't have the support from like a critical percentage of the population, right? So that's the thing. It's a conscript army. Like the people in the Syrian army, they don't want to be there. They don't want to be fighting, right? They want to be at home. They want to be with their kids. They want to return to normal civilian life. they're forced in a situation where they have to fight, because if they don't, their country is going to be overrun by who? I mean, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Jaish al-Islam, Ahrar al-Sham, all of these groups, right, that are backed by Turkey. And they're increasingly dominated by foreigners. So here is the similarity, right? In Syria, the forces waging war against the state now, and ever since I'd say about 2013, have been dominated by foreigners, right? They've got foreign commanders, they've got foreign, what they call mujahideen, coming in from all of these countries, right? Whereas in Yemen, the overwhelmingly foreign side is referred to as the legitimate government of Yemen, right? But if you look at the side that has the support of the indigenous population, the side that's relatively more indigenous, in Syria, it's the government of Bashar al-Assad, and in Yemen, it's the so-called Houthi rebels.
So, knowing that there's been a massive blockade imposed on Yemen, and the starvation, the drought that they're going through, COVID-19, how are they still, Ansarullah, how are they still able to take up arms and defend themselves when there's nothing coming in to the country?
I ask myself this question all the time, like how are they able to do this, right? I think it just comes down to their willingness to fight and resist. I remember watching this one speech by Sayyid Abdul Malik al-Houthi. He's the leader of Ansarullah today. And he said, it's more honorable to be scattered into the wind, to be crushed to dust, than to ever submit to these cowards, right? Wow. Referring to Saudi Arabia, wow. Right? Now, sometimes you see a level of political will, right? In struggles out there that you just cannot comprehend, and I just have to put it down to that.
So it's just put it down to a miracle.
I guess so, yeah. The Yemenis are a tough people. I mean, this is not the first time that they've had to fight off foreign conquerors, right? I mean, really, I'd say that this period in Yemen's history where they find themselves, fighting all of these foreigners that are just coming in to conquer them and occupy their land, it begins with the Ottomans, right? So in the 16th century, the Portuguese, they start to dominate the trading networks of the Indian Ocean. They start to monopolize all of the ports on the Indian Ocean, right? So the first place that the Portuguese went to was Kerala. Kerala is my homeland, right? I was born there. And over time, they started, over the course of the 15th century, they started to take over all of the ports, right, in the Indian Ocean. And the Ottomans perceived this to be a threat, right? And so they invaded Yemen. But they didn't just invade Yemen to protect the ports from the Portuguese. They also took all of the wealth, right? So Yemen is wealthy historically because of the trade, right? So I was reading the other day Najl Balagha, right? And I downloaded the PDF, right? Because then you can Control F and do keyword searches, right? So I haven't read the entire thing, right? But it points out that part of the reason why Yemen was able to be unified by the Himyarite dynasty in the 4th century is because the Himyarites had access to the Indian Ocean trade, and because they had because of naval technologies back then, they found it easier to transport goods from India, from Kerala, where I'm from, right? From Kerala to Yemen, right? And because of this, the trade picked up. The Himyarites became wealthy, and they were able to conquer all of the surrounding kingdoms and then unify Yemen, right? So the naval position that Yemen has is extremely important. Like a large percentage, I don't know exactly, right? I think it's like a third of the world's oil goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. And so Saudi Arabia ships a lot of its oil through that narrow strait. So the question that they're asking is, what happens if Yemen actually becomes an independent country? And then they're able to exploit their own natural resources and become wealthy, just as wealthy as, for example, the UAE. Imagine that. Imagine a country like Yemen with a revolutionary leader, right? With a revolutionary ideology, right? Like a mix of, like, let's say socialism and, like, revolutionary Shiism, right? Imagine if they come to power and they develop a strong navy. Do you think Saudi Arabia would be able to launch these proxy wars, right, against Syria and Iraq the way that they do? Do you think they'd be able to get away with supporting terrorism all across the region? I don't think they would, because a strong Yemen would be able to say, you can't ship your oil anymore. If you keep bullying countries in this way, we're not going to allow you to do that. And so there's been a concerted effort to keep Yemen poor. I think that's what's fundamentally driving the conflict.
So, how has this conflict shown the lack of autonomy in the Saudi political leadership?
Ooh, well, I think there's two things here, right? So yes, Saudi Arabia, if you look at its history, it's been propped up by the British, right? So after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, the British had to find, we're looking for allies, right, in the Arab world. And so the reason they went to the Saudis is because, according to Winston Churchill, it's because of their unfailing loyalty to us. This is what Winston Churchill said, right? He said, look, they're brutal, they believe in conquering their enemies and making slaves out of their wives and children, but I like this guy because he's loyal to me, right? And that's what the British liked about the Saudis. So if you look at Saudi Arabia, right, like, first of all, it's an artificial state, right? Saudi Arabia, the regime originates in the Nejd, as you know, right? Riyadh is in the Nejd. Now, historically, the Nejd did not control Hijaz, right? Hijaz was a part of the Ottoman Empire. And historically, they didn't control the provinces of Baha, Asir, Jizan, and Najran either. These are the southern four provinces of Saudi Arabia. Historically, they are Yemeni, right? Historically, they're Zaydi as well. So it's illegal, for example, in those areas to commemorate Ashura, right? You can go to jail. You can be executed for that, right? Like, there's 16-year-olds in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia who are facing the death penalty for protesting, right? Now, that's a level of oppression that you don't see in other countries in the Muslim world, right? But, you know, they've got oil and they're loyal to the United States. So, yeah, I think there's definitely the US-British factor here, right? That they, in large part, determine Saudi policy. So, for example, Saudi Arabia had one king who was relatively independent, King Faisal, right?
Yep.
He was assassinated, and what happened, right? He ended up being replaced by people who are far more loyal to the United States. So, yeah, I get what you're saying. You're completely right. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia does have its own interests because Yemen is their source of cheap labor, right? Like, all of these construction workers that they have in Saudi Arabia, right? I mean, they have impoverished workers from all over the world, right? But a lot of them do come from Yemen, right? And they want to keep Yemen that way. They want to keep Yemen poor. And they know that if they don't have their foot on the necks of the Yemeni people, Yemen will become a prosperous, self-defining revolutionary nation.
So how would you characterize the overall agenda of the United States in the Yemen conflict?
I think part of it is because the arms industry has weapons that need to be sold. And so they see Saudi Arabia as an important customer. But overall, the US strategy, I think, is governed by the petrodollar. So ever since 1975, 76, let's say, the US dollar has been backed unofficially by oil. Because in 1971, they got off the gold standard, right? So if your currency is no longer backed by gold, because they couldn't maintain the gold standard, they had to back it by something else. So that's when they cut the deal with the OPEC states, right? And they said, look, you sell your oil in dollars and then invest the proceeds in our banking system, right? And that's been kind of, that's been underwriting the American banking system ever since then. It's allowed the US to run persistent trade deficits. So the United States imports way more than they export, as they've done over time. And this is just, these trade deficits have just been growing, right? Like it's just been increasing since 1976. So this is a US interest. They have to keep the region subjugated. They have to ensure that their client states, like Saudi Arabia, run the show, right? Because if they don't, and other countries are able to rise up, like Iran or Yemen, then it can undermine their balance of power in the region. And
with regard to the Yemeni conflict, there are obviously main heads in this of the 22 to 26 countries that are parties to it. Which maybe 5 countries have the biggest influence on this conflict?
It's a good question. I'd say Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, United States, Britain, and Israel.
Does that come back to the fact that they're in bed together with the export and import of oil?
Yeah, it's partially that. I mean, Israel has its own interest, right? Because it's the most unpopular state in the region, if not the world, right? Because of the way it was founded, right? Like,
Definitely.
literally went there and then stole a fully furnished country, right? Like, not many countries, not many settler colonial regimes are created in that way, right? Like, imagine going to a piece of territory and saying, look, my ancestors lived here 2,000 years ago, right? And then stealing it and then having to lie to the entire population and concoct a story about why you're there. I mean, obviously, the Yemenis don't recognize the legitimacy of that because they're proud Arab nationalists. They're not selling out the Arab nationalist cause like certain other regimes, right? Other regimes that choose to fight against Iraq and fight against Syria and spend billions of dollars supporting terrorism against their fellow Arabs, their fellow Muslims, when they could have used that to support their fellow Palestinians, right? So that's like a major factor as well, right? I mean, Israel does not want to see another revolutionary government emerge in the region.
Definitely. And how does the war in Yemen differ from the other Arab Spring movements?
Well, Yemen was supposed to go down the road of the Arab Spring, right? Because the Arab Spring in 2011, part of it was this push by Turkey and Qatar to bring Muslim Brotherhood governments to power in the Arab republics, only the Arab republics, not the Arab monarchies, right? The Arab monarchies, you can't have revolutions there, right? You try and rise up against any government, you're dead, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what they tried to do, right? Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria. These are all republics. That's what they have in common. Yemen as well, right? These are republics. And so the push was for Muslim Brotherhood political parties to come to power in these countries. And in Yemen, that faction is the Islah Party, right? So in 2011, there were protests against the government that were attended by all the major opposition factions, right? So Ansarullah was there. They were protesting against the government. The Islahis were there. That's the Muslim Brotherhood in Yemen. And also the Southern Movement, right? And also some socialist groups as well. And they're all against the government for reasons that are fair enough, right? Corruption is a major issue, right? Yemenis, across the political spectrum, realize that there is a problem with the elites in their country taking money out of the country and putting it where? In Saudi Arabia, right? Because Saudi Arabia has patronage networks in the country, right? Where they say, look, we will back you, we will support your political campaigns, we'll help keep you in power, and in exchange, you have to be economically loyal to us, right? And so a lot of Yemenis realize that this is a problem. But the script was that in Yemen, the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated factions would pull off like a kind of regime change, right? So they'd get rid of Ali Abdullah Saleh and he'd be replaced by like a more Muslim Brotherhood friendly government, right? But that didn't happen. Instead, the government that came to power, which was backed by the Muslim Brotherhood and which the United States supported, this is the government of President Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. He came to power after the Arab Spring in 2011, right? So he comes to power and he's elected in an election where it's only his name on the ballot, right? The United States says that this is a legitimate election, right? No problems there. So at the same time, they're crying about the Syrian elections and saying, Syria is a dictatorship, etc., etc. Well, hang on. In 2014, Syria had a presidential election where there were 3 candidates on the ballot, right? Because they changed their entire constitutional framework so that they could have a multi-candidate presidential election. Before that, the way that it worked in Syria is that you could vote yes or no for the incumbent president, but you couldn't choose a different candidate. So they changed the constitution. In Yemen, they've got one guy on the ballot paper, right? And this is the guy that Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United States, all the big powers in the region, they want this guy to be in power. That's Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. But he ends up doing things that are extremely unpopular, right? So, for example, he slashes the subsidies on fuel. This causes fuel prices to rise by 195%, right? And this is a devastating blow to the Yemeni working class, because that's their bread, you know? Like when you raise the price of fuel, you raise the price of everything,
That's right?
And then he said that he wanted to divide the country into 6 federal units, right? Now, this was a very clever ploy by the Saudis to divide Yemen into rich and poor regions, right? That's what Ansarullah said. They said this is an attempt by Saudi Arabia to divide Yemen into resource-rich areas and resource-poor areas. The problem is that the resource poor areas have 80% of the population, and the resource rich areas have like 18% of the population. Even that's being generous, because the majority of that 18% are located in the port city of Aden, right? Like, you know, the Hadramaut coast, right?
Yep.
That's the coastline that faces the Indian Ocean, right? So, yeah, the reason the Saudis wanted this is because Hadramaut, which has like all of the natural resources in a small population, the Saudis want to run pipelines through there. The Saudis want that oil for themselves, as if they don't have enough oil, right? They want Yemen's oil, and this is like the poorest Arab country, right? So this was extremely unpopular with the Yemeni people. This is not a Sunni Shia issue, right? Let's make this very, very clear. The media tries to obfuscate. They try and say, oh, it's a Sunni Shia conflict. You've got Iran, they're backing the Shiites. You've got Saudi Arabia, they're backing the Sunnis, right? But this is an issue of Yemen's national interests, right? Neither Zaydis nor Sunnis, right, in Yemen would benefit from the federalization of the country, right, to weaken it and divide it in this way. And yet that's how the media presents it. I mean, the Zaydis themselves, mind you, like the Zaydis they're the Sunnis of the Shia and the Shia of the Sunnis, right? So there is no reason for example, a Salafi, right, someone who, you know, respects Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, to disrespect the Zaydis, because there's no reason for them to, because the Zaydis say, look, we have nothing against Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, we've got nothing against them. We reserve our preference for Ali ibn Abi Talib, right? But they accept the legitimacy of the first three caliphs, right? So they are completely non-offensive to every single school of Sunni Islam, right? And so this is not a Sunni Shia issue at all, right? This is about Yemen's national interest being violated by Saudi Arabia.
So how does this current conflict, how does the current conflict relate to past conflicts or historical conflicts in Yemen?
Yemen, You know, just off the previous thing that I was mentioning, so back in 1962, there was a Republican coup that took power in Yemen, right? And this is like a time when Yemen was divided between North and South. So I might actually just go through the history of that. So before the First World War, Yemen was divided between two empires, okay? So the Ottoman Empire controlled North Yemen. The British controlled South Yemen. So after the First World War, the plan was that the Saudis would take control of North Yemen and the British would take control of South Yemen, right? That was supposed to be the plan. It was going to be a nice little setup. And the Saudis were comfortable with that because they trust the British. The British put them in power, you know, and that didn't happen. The reason that didn't happen is because of the resistance of the Yemenis back then, right? So we talk about the resistance of the Yemenis today to Saudis. This happened back then, right? So just to answer your question. So in 1934, the Saudis, they invade North Yemen, but they're stopped. They're stopped dead in their tracks by the Imam of Yemen, right? So Imam Yahya Hamid ad-Din, very famous figure in Yemen, widely respected, and that's because he led the Yemenis in their resistance against the Saudis. If it wasn't for Imam Yahya Hamid ad-Din, the northern part of Yemen would be controlled by Saudi Arabia, right? The reason the borders that exist today between Saudi Arabia and Yemen are the borders that had to be fought for by the Yemenis themselves. That's where the Yemenis stopped the Saudis back then in 1934, right? So, I mean, they weren't strong enough. I mean, the Yemenis did not have the backing of the British. The Saudis were able to take the four territories of Yemen, Baha, Asir, Jizan, and Najran that I mentioned before, because they had British backing, right? So, yeah, this is a conflict that just repeats itself.
So you mentioned before that it's not a Sunni Shia issue.
Yeah.
Would it ever be categorized as a religious issue? Maybe not between two sects, but as a religious issue between the Yemenis and the Saudis?
In a sense, yeah, but I wouldn't put it in terms of Sunni and Shia. So if you look at Wahhabism, if you look at Salafism, if you look at their scholars, right? So for example, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Ghazali, Ibn Taymiyyah, they all say this one thing, right? And they've all quoted it and paraphrased different versions of pretty much the same thing, which is that it's better to live under, it's 60 years under an oppressive tyrant is preferable to one night of anarchy, right? They all say roughly the same thing. And that's a kind of geopolitical take, I guess, that Saudi Arabia would prefer, right? Because it's a way of cementing their power. So in countries where they call the shots and they support the political status quo, they encourage quietism, right? They encourage Muslims to put up with oppressive rulers, right? Now, of course, in a country like Syria, right, where they don't like the government for other reasons, because it's allied with Iran, Iraq, because of Saudi Arabia's now not so secret relationship with Israel, right? It's basically an open alliance these days, right? There they encourage, people, you should rise up against the government, right? Even if the people rising up against the government are majority foreigners, right? So I think that's the main issue here, right? You've got Wahhabism, which historically has encouraged, deference towards authority, respect for the status quo, even if it's corrupt and unjust. And then on the other hand, you've got Zaydism, right? And one of their core tenets is khuruj, that Muslims have an obligation to rebel against corrupt and unjust rulers. So polar opposites, right?
Yeah, definitely.
This isn't a Sunni Shia thing.
So how does the issue of or the conflict in Yemen relate to the forced colonization of Palestine?
It's a good question. I guess the similarity here is that Yemen is to Saudi Arabia what Palestine is to Israel. So like I mentioned before, you know how I mentioned there's those 4 provinces of Yemen that are occupied by Saudi Arabia, right? That's basically like the West Bank and Gaza for the Yemenis, right? Because the indigenous population of Yemenis, right, they've had their rights stripped from them. They can't practice their own religion. They have to stay quiet, and they have to allow their territories to be taken over by people that Saudi Arabia bring in from the outside, because they want to change the demographics of the region, right? I mean, this is usually what happens when you have an unjust occupation and you've got an indigenous population that don't accept the occupation, right? The occupation tries to bring in people from outside. It's like with Palestine, right? What happened? I mean, you have lots of Europeans coming in to displace the local Palestinian population. So similarly, in what I call northern Yemen or Saudi-occupied Yemen, they did exactly the same thing. So there are similarities there. So it's the Palestine that nobody talks about. And
what can you say about the Yemeni blockade at the moment? What are the main points of the Yemeni blockade, and what is it trying to achieve?
It's trying to starve the Yemenis into submission. It's just that simple. They know that they can't win a fair fight with the Yemenis, right? Like if they were to, if the Saudis were to simply back the forces, like if the Saudis were simply to back the Yemenis on the ground who support them and they have an alliance with, they would lose in they just lose the war, right? There's no way they could win the war that way, because they don't have enough Yemenis on the ground who have their support. You got to remember that when people talk about the Houthi takeover of Sana'a in September 2014, this was like one of the most bloodless revolutions you'll ever see, right? Like barely anyone died. I mean, there were a few clashes, like 100 people died or something like that, right? But it's not like in Syria where there's been this attempt to overthrow the state, which has resulted in like tens of thousands of people being, what am I saying? Like 400,000 dead, right?
Yeah.
I mean, 100,000 of that are Syrian army soldiers, mind you, right? That part isn't ever mentioned. But in Yemen, the Ansarullah, they were able to take over Sana'a because they had the support of the Yemeni Interior Ministry. They had the support of the Yemeni army. There were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets waving Ansarullah placards, right? And so they had the mass support of the Yemeni people, right? Yeah.
What's been the human cost so far in Yemen?
You know, it's hard to calculate because the death toll that they give you in the media is something like 100,000, 80 to 100,000. But they also mention that 13 million people are starving, right? And so really we have to wait for a census to be done, and that can only be done after the war. So I predict that at the end of this war, we will find out that the total death toll is probably 2-3 million, something like that.
Wow.
So half the Jewish Holocaust.
Mm. Can you comment on the Ansarullah strike on Aramco in Saudi Arabia?
Right, yeah. I mean, this is the reason why this is impressive is because the Yemenis are blockaded, right? So they're not getting weapons from anyone. People keep talking about, the Houthis are getting weapons from Iran. They're getting weapons from Iran. I'm like, how? They're barely getting food into the country. And every single food shipment that comes, right, they inspect it thoroughly to the point where the food is rotting and just sitting on the ports, right? It's like right next to the ports. The Saudis aren't allowing it to reach the starving Yemeni people because they say, it's full of weapons, right? Even after they've inspected it and revealed that there's no weapons there whatsoever, right? And so, okay, the Yemenis are not getting weapons from the Iranians, right? So what have they done? They're reverse engineering drones, right, themselves, right?
Wow.
So what's happened is that they've got a few, maybe personnel from outside, maybe from Lebanon, maybe from Iran, I don't know, right? And these people come with expertise, they come with knowledge, they come with blueprints, designs, right? And they've been, because of Yemeni ingenuity and whatever solidarity they get from overseas, they've managed to reverse engineer the drones that last year in September took out the facility in Upcake, right? And then it caused oil prices to skyrocket briefly to the point where the Americans had to release their own strategic reserves of oil in order to keep the price stable.
So if they aren't receiving weapons from outside Yemen, do you think it's coming down to more the revolutionary mindset that you mentioned earlier that's allowing them to push this far and make like an attack that big?
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be. I mean, Yemenis know that their true place in the world is not reflected by where they are in the world today, right? I mean, Yemen historically is a rich, prosperous country, right? I mean, we're talking about the land of the Queen of Sheba, right? We're talking about, one of the first nations to convert to Islam, right? The story goes that first the Prophet Muhammad sent Khalid ibn al-Walid to Yemen, right, to convert the people, but he was unsuccessful after being there for a few months. And then Ali ibn Abi Talib was sent, and he managed to convert the entire Yemeni nation, right? Like Bani Hamdan, right, one of the largest tribes in Yemen. Anyone here with the surname Hamdan? No, okay. Well, Hamdan's a common name, right? Like in Lebanon and other Arab countries, right? It's Yemeni, right? Like the Yemenis played a major role in the development of early Islam, right? And so the Yemenis know their place in history, right? And so they're not going to put up with being treated like dirt, right? They know that eventually they have to put up a struggle. They have to put up a fight if they're to retain and regain their rightful place in the world. I think that's what's driving them. The other thing is Yemeni army stockpiles, right? Like it's not foreign weapons, it's not Iranian weapons, it's not coming from outer space, right? It's just Yemeni army stockpiles. It's because they have the Ansarullah movement is fighting alongside, shoulder to shoulder with the Yemeni army, right? They're not rebelling against the Yemeni army, which is what you think when you hear that they're rebelling against the Yemeni government, right? The Yemeni government is basically this one guy, Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi. And you know what? Abdurrahman Mansour Hadi is under house arrest in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is bombing and starving a country on behalf of someone that they've placed under house arrest. That would be like Russia placing Bashar al-Assad under house arrest in Moscow and saying we're acting on behalf of the Syrian government. Right? That's the absurdity of the situation. The media doesn't comment on it.
So there have been reports coming out of the Middle East, let's say, of certain military groups assisting the Yemenis in this fight against, let's say, Saudi Arabia and the other countries. Is that just hearsay, or?
I just don't see evidence of it, right? Like, I mean, if there was, I wouldn't like condemn it. I mean, I think a country that is fighting for its right to exist, fighting for its survival, has the right to call on foreign allies and foreign support and weapons, right? But I just don't see the evidence for it, right? I mean, yeah, maybe they're getting blueprints on how to reverse engineer missiles or something like that, but beyond that, I just don't see it happening.
Is it because it's not possible, or is there something else at play here where they can't actually access these weapons? Or
well, there is a theory that how we mentioned the strike on the Saudi oil facility. There is an alternate theory that the strike wasn't actually it was carried out on behalf of the Yemeni national resistance, but the drones actually came from Iraq or something like that, right? That's like another theory. I'm not too sure. The Yemeni national resistance government says that they did it, right? So
We'll take their word for it. We'll take their word for it.
yeah.
And do you think the Ansarullah movement will eventually come to a point where they've succeeded in this revolution, or do you think that they're just going to be dried out by the Saudis through this blockade, through the COVID crisis, through the famine that they're facing? Like Yemen, I think the UNICEF statement of largest humanitarian crisis is just like a politically correct way to say it.
Yeah.
When it's a lot more than that.
It's genocide.
It's
We should
genocide.
call it genocide.
It is genocide. So will there come a point, in your opinion, where the Ansarullah movement will prosper?
There's been moments where I was hopeful that the war was going to come to a close, but I think this is one of those situations where the Saudis, they just know that they can keep starving the country, right? And I don't see this. I mean, I've just given up hope that it's just going to end anytime soon, right? So I think it's going to be a long struggle, but I think there's diplomatic ways in which to alleviate the suffering. So, like I mentioned before, Iran and Oman have been thanked by the Yemeni National Salvation Government in Sana'a for delivering medical assistance. So, hopefully, through negotiations, they can start to ease the blockade and food can come through. And in the short term, we should be hoping for the alleviation of those humanitarian concerns, right? So that the Yemenis can eat. That's the most important thing.
Definitely. So Nobel laureate Tawakkul Karman has said that Saudi Arabia is legally responsible for the crimes that the Arab coalition has led against Yemen. Do you think that this has had any effect on the international stage?
The problem is that Saudi Arabia is acting according to international law. I know that sounds insane, right? But if you look at UN Resolution 2216, Saudi Arabia is acting on behalf of the legitimate government of Yemen, and their role is to disarm the Houthi rebels. That's according to UN Resolution 2216. And here's the thing, I mean, people accuse me of not being critical enough of Saudi Arabia and Russia. But here, I think it's entirely legitimate to be critical of those countries because they could have used their power of veto at the UN Security Council to veto that resolution. All they had to do was put their hand up and say, we veto this resolution, right? And it would not have been legal. Saudi Arabia would then had to launch an illegal invasion of Yemen, right? And it would have been declared as such. We could actually say, as the Yemeni Solidarity Council, Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen is illegal, right? And so I think the way to turn this war into an illegal Saudi genocide against Yemen, right? Because, I mean, legality matters, right? It changes the framing, right? Because if the framing is Saudi Arabia acting on behalf of the legitimate government of Yemen to defeat Houthi rebels, then that sounds a lot less worse than Saudi Arabia illegally invading a country, right? Yeah. And imposing mass starvation and genocide upon its population while bombing its infrastructure and health facilities.
So if we look at it as a legal issue, then wouldn't that make the illegal genocide of the Palestinian nation a legal issue as well, and looked at as such by the international community?
Well, even with Palestine, right? I mean, the only part of the Israel-Palestine conflict that's illegal from an Israeli point of view is the occupation of the West Bank and the siege of Gaza, right? The rest of that territory, historic Palestine, is legal as far as international law is concerned, because the UN voted for the creation of Israel back in 1948. So this is the thing. I mean, don't put everything on legality, right? Just because something is legal doesn't mean it's moral, and just because something is moral doesn't mean it's legal.
100%. So as we've seen in the past 5 to 6 months, a bit more in some countries, the pandemic or the coronavirus pandemic has basically created a destruction of life, economically, socially, and it's a massive health issue as well. So how has this affected the Yemeni people?
I think the most absurd story about coronavirus, I've seen a few stories. So the first one is that, like, this is from a few months ago, the Saudis, because countries all over the world went into lockdown, Saudi Arabia did exactly the same thing. And so there's a large labor force in Saudi Arabia, really, really poor people from all over the world, right? Somalia, India, Bangladesh, Yemen, you name it. But the ones that aren't from Yemen, right, the ones that are from other countries in the world, they were kind of redundant in the situation, right? So they didn't have jobs. So what did the Saudis do? They gathered all of these poor workers and they pushed them towards the Yemeni border, right? And so it's like, well, because this is like back in March or something, right? Everyone's freaking out, like this virus, it's growing exponentially, it's like 30 times deadlier than the flu, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, what are the Saudis doing? Irresponsibly, they're taking, 1,000 people or whatever and then pushing them towards the Yemeni border and trying to push them into Yemen, right? I had a fight with a guy on Twitter like a month or two ago because he was making the argument that this was the fault of the Houthis. He was saying the Houthis are trying to stop like black Africans from entering their country, or trying to make them sound racist or something, right? Okay, well, if you're waging a war of national resistance, right, against a genocidal occupation, you're going to care about your borders a little bit, right? Because you don't know who's coming across the border. I mean, there's also been stories, the kind of craziness that you see on the internet, right, just shows you that people can get away with saying all kinds of nonsense about Yemen, knowing that they're not going to face a backlash because the media simply isn't reporting it the way they should be. But the other thing is that there were some reports of the Saudis, they started randomly dropping PPE, like protective equipment, in Sana'a. And then all of a sudden, like the response of the National Salvation Government, that is the Houthi government, was suspicion, right? They were like, well, why would the Saudis care about protecting us or giving us protective equipment when they're committing genocide against us, right? And so they seized all of these boxes, right? And then they tried to, and they were suspecting that maybe these were infected with coronavirus or something like that, right? But I don't know what's happened about that.
That's still just...
It's still up in the air, I'm not sure. But coronavirus is kind of low on the list of priorities in Yemen, right? When you've got a starvation siege and non-stop bombing.
Definitely.
I think Yemen will take bullets over medicine at this stage, right?
I think
got a massive fight on their hands, so they'd rather bullets than food. And
I think they prefer that the entire country got coronavirus in exchange for the war ending, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So
with regards to social media, what impact can it have on raising awareness to the crimes that are happening in Yemen at the moment?
Well, I look at you go to YouTube, right? And what's impressive and what gives me hope is that there are a lot of Muslim channels. So if you go to One Path, that's one of them, right? I mean, not to plug them, right? Because they say a lot of things that I disagree with, right? That's putting it mildly. But that just shows that, if you put in effort like what you guys are doing, you can get your voice out there. Unfortunately, they don't talk about Yemen because of their allegiances and whatnot, right? I don't want to go too far because I don't want to, danger my own safety. But But no, I mean, it just shows that, because of social media, because of the democratization of the internet, because of YouTube, you can start up channels, you can start conversations. But at the same time, you have to make sure that you have other channels of communication out there, right? So, for example, there's a website called Shia TV, right? And a lot of stuff that gets taken down on YouTube, right? Because it's, supporting dangerous individuals or violating community standards, you can find there. So you gotta find these alternate forms of social media as well. And if you can break through to them, if you can develop an audience, then the next step from that point onwards is to lobby, right? Because the thing is, if you can go to politicians and say, look, we represent the Arab community, or we represent the Muslim community, or even the Shia Muslim community, which is a subset of that, then they're more likely to take you seriously than me, for example, going to them and being like, hey, I represent the Yemen Solidarity Committee. I'm I'm a PhD student. And then they'll be like, well, you in what army, right? Like, who do you represent? How many votes are you going to bring to the table, right? Because here's the thing. I mean, we have to recognize that we have to learn from the Zionists, right? I mean, the Zionists in this country, I'm just amazed at how effective they are, right? they have so many organizations. I mean, they have a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, the other Muslim organizations, right, that don't advocate for our causes, to put it that way, right? They have a lot of money as well, right? So money is another issue, right? So then there's got to be fundraising and things like that. So it's a combination, right? Social media, but also alternative social media, so you don't get taken down and censored, because a lot of these major social media platforms, unfortunately, are vetted and controlled by intelligence agencies. But at the same time, lobbying and using community support to speak to your politicians as well. I think you can have an impact if you do those things.
So, with regard to getting taken off the internet and things like that, because you're violating community standards, there's been other movements or other pushes off the internet, such as protests and, like you said, lobbying. There have been a few groups that have lobbied their local MPs. Do you think that has had any effect in like creating awareness at the very least?
There have been some politicians who have spoken out in defense of Yemen. I don't know that it's as a result of lobbying. There was a few years ago, there was one lawyer who put in a Freedom of Information request to figure out what Australia's arms exports to Saudi Arabia were, and we found out some information from that. There's also Peter Whish-Wilson from the Greens. I remember one of the speeches that he gave in Parliament where he revealed that the Australian Navy was helping to train the Saudi Navy to impose the blockade. Not only that, the Australian Navy was blocking Australia's own aid to Yemen, right? So he got up in Parliament, he said, so we're blocking our own aid, why are we doing that? And he asked this question to Maurice Payne, right? And she's in charge of, I forget the ministry exactly. She's in government, in the current government. And there was no real response, right? Because Australia at that same time was working on its arms catalogue, right? Because Australia, unfortunately, we've gotten rid of all of our manufacturing, right? So I look at all of the stuff that you have in this room and I think, why can't Australia make these things? Why can't Australia make these microphones and smartphones and things like that? What we are making is weapons, right? So we have weapons catalogs. And so Saudi Arabia is a customer for us, right? And so we have to be able to balance, we have to be able to expose this, right? We have to be able to say, look, we have to make the humanitarian argument, essentially.
And personally for you, what does this conflict in Yemen mean to you as an individual?
Oh, man, I mean, for me, it started with Syria, right? So I was active in Hands Off Syria, have been since 2012, 2013. And, before that, I'd always observed what was happening in the Middle East, right? I think the radicalizing point for me was in 2003 when the Americans invaded Iraq, and also at the same time the Second Intifada was happening in Palestine, right? And Yasser Arafat had died. We didn't know back then that he was assassinated, mind you, right? So all of those events back in 2003, 2004, they had an influence on me, right? Because you see the injustice, right? And the thing is, I was lucky because my dad encouraged me to watch the news, right? Back then, SBS was a lot better than it is today, right? And so they used to report on the Second Intifada. They used to report on the invasion of Iraq. I used to watch the news with my dad. I was angry about it, right? But I never thought that I really had to get involved, right? Because there were already a lot of people talking about it. Like, you had the socialist groups on campus at universities. They were talking about Palestine and the occupation of Iraq a lot. So I figured, you know what? They've got it covered. I don't have to do anything about it. Come 2011, right? I realized that these socialist groups and, unfortunately, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, and also, unfortunately, a lot of the Muslim community ended up taking the wrong side on Syria, right? In the sense that I understood the Syrian conflict back in 2012 as like, okay, well, this is a situation in which there is an attempt to overthrow the Syrian government. So I would like those people who support the overthrow of the Syrian government to justify why. I think the onus should be on them to justify why they support the overthrow of the Syrian government. The onus is not on us to explain why the status quo should remain the way it is, right? The onus is on you, right? Because when you define your position about a conflict by what you're against rather than what you're for, then it allows you to cover up what you're for, right? So instead of saying, oh, I'm in favor of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State overthrowing the Syrian government, they simply said, I'm against Assad, right? So I thought this is not like a fair way of framing the conflict, right? So that's how I got involved in Hands Off Syria. And then the war in Yemen happened, right? Which wasn't getting anywhere near as much attention as Syria. And I thought, you know what, like eventually I said, look, I have to take this responsibility as well, right? Because nobody was talking about it. I mean, there are a lot of great journalists who are talking about it, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't getting the same attention as Syria. And part of the reason for that, and I think this is an important point, in Syria, the reason why that conflict got a lot of attention is because the demonization of the Syrian government was the means by which the media could manufacture consent for the overthrow of the Syrian government. Whereas in Yemen, there is no humanitarian pretext you can offer for why the Saudis are waging this war, right? And so instead of giving Yemen lots and lots of attention the way that they did with Syria, they have to suppress any discussion of it. So if they're suppressing discussion of Yemen, then I have to talk about it. Mm-hmm. There's enough people talking about Palestine, in my opinion, so I don't spend much time talking about Palestine, right? Yeah.
Where to from here for Yemen?
Where to? I think that in the long term, in the short and medium term, it's going to be tough, man, because you've got an entire generation who are going to be stunted, like physically stunted, right? Like people who, you know, kids who would have normally grown to be 5'8" are going to be like 5'3", you know, and they're going to be skinny, they're going to have health issues because of the starvation, right?
That's right.
You know, so that's short to medium term is going to be tough. But I think long term, Yemen is going to be one of the most prosperous, one of the most beautiful countries in the Arab world.
It's definitely worth the wait.
It's going to return to its historic glory.
Is
That's
there
what I
any
think is
UN
gonna happen.
any UN boots on the ground in Yemen?
There are. They're like located mainly in like places like Hodeidah, which is like where the port is. And so their job is to try and negotiate the entrance of food aid into Yemen. But, you know, their role hasn't always been positive, you know, so...
No, it hasn't.
Yeah, so, you know, sometimes you see them leveling accusations at Ansarullah, you know, and saying Ansarullah is like, you know, seizing the food aid or something like that, right? Or, you know, or Ansarullah is like, you know, wasting the food. And then what they don't mention is that the reason why Ansarullah, for example, isn't distributing the food to the people is because the food's gone rotten, right? Because it's been sitting there in the sweltering heat in the Arab summer, right, going rotten, going off, because the Saudis are delaying the entry of the food aid, right? And they're doing that on purpose. They've checked it takes them like, you know, a week or something to check the food check the container ships for weapons, right? And they've got metal detectors and everything like that, right? And then after that, they're still delaying the entry of that aid for months on end. So that's the unfortunate role of the UN, right? Because this is a legal war, as I mentioned before.
That's right. So for you personally, you mentioned that you're speaking out against the crisis in Yemen. What other things are you pursuing to make it known to the international community that this is a genocide rather than just a legal issue?
Well, the genocide fact, I think a lot of people know, right? And it's just that, I mean, yeah, you can spend time basically saying, hey, there's a genocide, right? But at the same time, I think it's important for the people who would be most ideologically sympathetic towards the Yemeni struggle, particularly in Western countries like Australia, to understand more about the Yemeni story, right? Like, how did Yemen get to this point? You know, a few years ago, it was revealed that in 1977, the president of North Yemen was assassinated by Saudi Arabia, right? This made huge news. I should have mentioned this before, because this is important, right? So, have you heard of President Ibrahim al-Hamdi?
Yes.
Yeah. He was the president of North Yemen. He took power in 1974 in a bloodless coup, and he was a modernizing Arab nationalist president. He wanted good relations with South Yemen, and a lot of Yemen's infrastructural development, right, that still like serves the country today happened on his watch, right? He was a very impressive leader. Saudi Arabia hated him. So it was always like an open secret that Saudi Arabia had him killed, right? And then we discovered after the Ansarullah, the Houthi revolution in 2014, that it's actually true. Saudi Arabia was directly responsible for his assassination. And that's when after his assassination, they eventually installed Ali Abdullah Saleh, and that paved the way for 34 years in which Yemen became a vassal, essentially an impoverished vassal of Saudi Arabia. So these kind of points in history, they matter, right? Like Syria, by comparison, in the 1970s, right? Like that's when the corrective movement, right? Like the Ba'athist government came to power, right? In 1973 under Hafez al-Assad. When they came to power, Syria had illiteracy. There was extreme poverty. Like a lot of the country didn't have electricity. Now, within the space of 20 years, completely electrified the country. Syria, prior to the conflict in 2011, despite having one of the lowest per capita incomes, third or fourth lowest. It's like a lower to middle income country. This is before the war, back in 2011, right? So even now it's even worse, right? Like Lebanon right next door as well, financial crisis, right? Money leaving the country, you name it. But Syria in 2011, despite having one of the lower per capita incomes in the Arab world, when it came to education, life expectancy, the role of women, all of these issues, Syria, all of these like social development indicators, human development indicators, Syria punched above its weight, right? It punched well above its income level. So it's got an income level which is like $3,000, $4,000, but in terms of life expectancy, it's like 75, and it's got a pretty decent healthcare system. It's got free education at like the university level, right? Now, this is the path that Yemen could have taken, right, if President Ibrahim al-Hamdi wasn't assassinated, right? And so sometimes, you look at a country and you look at Syria and you think, oh, well, it's not perfect, the government's got problems, right? But, it could be much worse. Look at Yemen, right? When their Arab nationalist president was assassinated in 1977, what happened? What did it pave the way for?
Thank you very much for your time, Jay.
No worries.
Thanks,
Very
Jay.
good having you. Thank you very much.